On the subject of relationships, one of the elements between Russia and the United States today, and indeed Russia and Europe today, is the allegation that Russia interfered in elections. Mr. Putin, this week you told a French newspaper that Russia is being accused of interfering with the U.S. election by people who lost that election, who don't want to admit defeat. But all 17 of the United States intelligence agencies have concluded that the Russians did interfere with our election, and these are nonpartisan career professionals, Republicans and Democrats alike on Capitol Hill, including President Trump's supporters, and some are your defenders, who have seen the classified intelligence report, have all accepted this conclusion. And even private, nonpartisan security firms say the same, that Russia interfered with the U.S. election. Are they all wrong?
Have you read those reports?
I read the unclassified version.
Публичную, общественную версию.
Or the non-classified version, which is null and void. And who was your tailor? What about the pockets? What about the buttons? Do you have any claims about this suit, about the buttons? No, they are firmly tied, but you can't wear this suit. Can it happen? Yes, it did happen with one of our stand-up comedians, Mr. Aiken. And you've been telling me now about the non-classified versions. I read those reports. Even in those reports, there is no specific evidence, no facts, just assumptions, allegations, and conclusions based on the allegations, nothing more. You know, if there is something specific, concrete, we could discuss that. Like in one of the entities I previously used to work for, they said, we need all the evidence, addresses, all the names and the surnames. Provide all that to us. With respect to independent sources, there are no independent sources in this world. And, you know, the recent appointments with your special services point to the fact that there are any likings, any attitudes. So I believe that we should stop this idle prattle, which is harmful. And I believe this is like transferring the internal political bickering of the United States beyond the borders of the country, outside, on the international stage, trying to resolve political matters with the help of the foreign policy tools and international affairs. And that is detrimental to international affairs and the global economy and the issues of global security and fight against terror, which is detrimental. And I have just cited an example when the Washington, D.C. did not recommend the professionals to go to an anti-terrorist event of the Russian Federation, which is nonsense. And these people, these very same people, initiate and are behind those reports. I believe that this should stop as soon as possible. We should start and resume normal cooperation. Well, in addition, I can tell you that worldwide, there are not so many countries that have the privilege of sovereignty. I wouldn't like to offend anyone, but what has been said by Madam Merkel is conditioned by the long amassing grudge she's been harboring. Just believe me, no matter what she responds afterwards, that the sovereignty is limited. And inside the military and political alliances, it's officially limited. The charters prescribe all prohibitions. And in practice, it's even stricter and more stringent. Nothing is permitted but for what is allowed. And who allows that? The leadership. And where is the leadership? Far away. So globally, there are not many countries wielding sovereignty, and we've been daring our sovereignty, the fact that we have our sovereignty. We can enjoy that fully, but Sovereignty is needed to defend our interests. It's not a toy. We needed to have our own development. India has their own sovereignty. They hold it and possess it. And I'll tell the Honorable Prime Minister, I never told him, although last night we had lengthy talks and a one-on-one dinner, but I want to tell him right now, we know the position of the Indian Prime Minister and the Indian leadership and the Indian state with respect to all the attempts to incline India to occupy a position that would be favorable to someone but not to the Indian people against Russia. India, basing on their own sovereignty and the character of their leader and the national interests, is not led astray by those requirements and those who give this advice. But there are not so many countries like India worldwide. This is true, and we must be aware of that. India is one of such countries. China may be cited as another example. There are some other countries, not numerous though. And if such attempts to guide someone, to dictate their will to someone from inside or outside the country will continue, they will be detrimental to international affairs. But I reiterate in closing this response, this should come to an end sooner or later.
So one of the reasons the question is relevant is because the United States views this as a matter of its national sovereignty, and as does the UK, as does Germany, as does France, and so it keeps coming up over and over. And what they say in response to the question of where is the proof is that this type of disinformation campaign is intentionally difficult to find hardcore proof of. It's other factors. And what the experts say is that this couldn't have been faked, that it's not one factor, that it's 100 factors that point to Russia. They say it's the forensics, it's the digital fingerprints, it's the IP addresses, the malware, the encryption keys, the specific pieces of code, that all of them point to Russia, and none of them points to anyone other than Russia.
Какие отпечатки?
What fingerprints, or hooves prints, or horn prints? What are you talking about? IP addresses, they can be invented. You know, there are very many specialists that can invent or fix it up. You know, a kid of yours can send it. Your girl that is 3-year-old can perpetrate such an attack. And they present it like this. They can pass it off like this, and these specialists can invent anything, and then they will blame someone else. These are not proofs. These are trying to shirk responsibility, and we don't have the problem. The problem is inside the American policy. The Trump team has turned to be more efficient during the electoral campaign. Sometimes I thought that, well, he overdoes, he overkills, I thought sometimes during the campaign. But it turned out that he was right. He's been able to find approach and to reach out to those electors whom he hoped for, and they voted for him. And the other team, they made a mistake, and they don't want to recognize this mistake right now. They don't want to say that they were not wise enough. It's easy to say it's not our fault. It's the Russians. They intervened. They interfered. It's like anti-Semitism. The Jews are to blame. You're an idiot because the Jews are to blame, right? And you know what such moods lead to? They will not end up in nothing good. One should work and think how to rectify things. And you have mentioned disinformation. What disinformation? One of the stovepiping facts by hackers is that one of the leaks by hackers is that the head of Madam Clinton's electoral office was not behaving properly against with respect to other candidates of the Democratic Party. But then when that appeared in public, she acknowledged it was true, and she handed in her resignation. So that was a truthful fact. And who was the author of the leak does not matter. It is important to have a look at that, consider that, apologize to people and say that we'll never ever do that again. But what did they do instead? They said it's not our blame. It's the Russians. Were the Russians dealing with all that, trying to rush one of the candidates of the Democratic Party in prejudice of someone else? It was in between themselves. Just stop that, please.
Even President Trump has said now that he believes Russia did it. So it's not just people who don't want President Trump in the office. And the difference between the hacking and the disinformation is real.
Oh, come on. Once again.
This is the conclusion of the 17 U.S. intelligence agencies and the others.
Американские агентства, 17 агентств в области безопасности говорят,
Hacked into the Democratic National Committee and hacked into Hillary Clinton's campaign emails, but that they also perpetuated a campaign of disinformation that involved putting out fake news stories through Russian-controlled entities like RT and Sputnik, and that those then were pushed by aggregators and what they're called bots on Twitter and elsewhere, and specifically targeted at voters who were potentially pro-Trump, voters in the Rust Belt of America, in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, who were potentially gettable for Trump. And that is the conclusion that they have reached.
Вот мы все должны брать.
all of us should take the American mass media's role model, you know. Megyn has been demonstrating today high class in her profession, because I have just cited an example that points out that there was no disinformation, no matter who was behind that leak about the Democratic Party. And the fact is that that director handed in her resignation. Once again, she says it's about disinformation. What kind of disinformation? I can't see any manifestation thereof. I don't know that.
То, что
And what President Trump has been saying, just show me the quote. He won, he said, because of the Russian intervention. I don't remember him saying so.
He did. He finally came around to saying, I think Russia did it, and he said, I don't think he'll do it again.
опять, вот ей кажется.
Well, you see, it seems it's a very, very serious question of world politics, and this is an impression, or what seems to you that you're talking about. This is not just as simple as holding an interview or writing an article in a newspaper. As for the interference, look at what your colleagues are doing in our country. They have been deep down in our domestic policies, doing what they want, enjoying themselves on a systemic basis. For many years, they've been unceremoniously, grossly interfering within our domestic affairs at the level of diplomatic embassies. This has to stop. It's going to be easier for everyone, for you and for us as well.
Prime Minister President Putin said the other day that Russia